Warami Miriga. Hello friends. Budri Najunyan Dharug. Good to see you on Dharug country. Welcome to 11 Stories from the River Dyarubbin's audio walk at Governor Phillip Park, Balga Ngurrang, Windsor. Naya Giada Erin. My name is Erin. Naya Dharug Burabrangal Yurian. I belong to the Burabrangal clan of the Dharug people. Bayajul Ubanga Ganonigang Yurang Gurugu Yagu Burabubu Dharug Yurang. I pay respects to my elders past, present and emerging. Yanawiju Manuwiwa Muru Warangat. Walk with me in the footsteps of our ancestors. Nurragingy Double Wamili Dyarubbin. Listen to the story of our Dyarubbin. This river is our ancestor, a living, breathing being, sung into existence from creation. The river holds our dreaming, our creation stories and our songlines. It is a sacred highway connecting us across countries and nations. Dyarubbin tells a shared creation story of Gurangady, Maribara, the great eagle. The river is our home, from Yarramundi, Yarramundi, and Balga Ngurrang, the camp on the sand at Richmond, to Dharamulan, place of the falling stars at Lower Portland. Remember, Miniga, tread softly on this dreaming. We were strong here, we remain strong here, we will always be strong here.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are advised that this audio walk contains stories of historical violence and Aboriginal people now resting in the dreaming. Listen and enjoy the stories, but please do not reproduce them in any way. Thank you. Didjirigura.
Yanma, let's head along the path towards the river. We're on Dyarubbin's floodplain. This ground is reclaimed by the river when it overflows its banks in flooding. In recent years, floodwaters have risen between 3 and 6 metres above where we are standing. Over the river to the west in the distance, you can see the mountains. Over millennia, many of Dyarubbin's tributaries have cut through the mountains, the Warragamba, Nepean, Gross, Colo and Gurangady and McDonald rivers. When the path turns to head along the river, let's stop and contemplate the deep time geology of this river, which has shaped the country all around us and formed much of the rock throughout the Sydney Basin.
My name's Tom Hubble. I'm an engineering geologist that works on lakes, rivers and out in the deep ocean. When I stand here, what I see is the really large landform. So the Blue Mountains Lapston monocline, which is about 5, 6, 7 kilometres away from here. That's an upwarping of the generally flat-lying sedimentary rocks of the Greater Sydney area. So there's the Hawkesbury sandstone, which sits above the Dyarubbin group, and above the Hawkesbury sandstone we've got the Wianamatta group, which is the Ashfield and the Brinjolly shales. And so the shales, the fine-grained rocks, are mostly lake sediments deposited 200 and something million years ago in an enormous trough that ran the length of eastern Australia and down into Antarctica, with massive rivers feeding that lake. And prior to the formation of that lake, it was a giant alluvial riverine plain. The precursor of the present-day Hawkesbury was up there. Somewhere between 3 and 6 kilometres above us, there was rock. Over the last 120, 140, maybe 160 million years, that rock has been gradually weathered away and eroded out and transported out into the Tasman Sea. So the Hawkesbury Valley that we all recognise and love, where we are now, which is pretty open country, and then we get the sandstone gorges up around Warragamba and through Camden and down south towards Menangle. Those valleys were cut by a river that cut all the way down through those rocks, and the actions of those rivers and the fullness of time has removed all of the rock that was adjacent to the river channels, even quite some distance, kilometres and kilometres away, east and west or north and south from where the channel is presently.
Behind Behind us, the ground rises to Balga Ngurrang, our hill camp, which became the town of Windsor. Balga Ngurrang is a hill between Dyarubbin and Wianamatta, South Creek, which winds around the turf farms to our right. It remains above water in the highest of the known floods and would have been a safe place to camp. We're walking towards where Wianamatta joins Dyarubbin.
Ngaya Jasmine Burrabarongul Dharug Dalang. I am Jasmine from the grey kangaroo people of the Sydney Basin area. I am the 5 times great granddaughter of Maria Locke and the 3 times great granddaughter of Hannah Locke. Hannah Locke lived at McGrath Hill behind the pub on South Creek. Hannah's family travelled to Hawkesbury by boat constantly. They spent a lot of time on the river. They had an orange orchard. They were farmers. My family have always lived along the Dyarubbin. When my uncle was a child, he said he remembers the river being crystal clear, being able to see right to the bottom, seeing perch and mullet and eel everywhere, and the tide covering little native orchids. And you just think what an incredible place it would have been. The 1940s, yeah. My grandmother, Laurel Douglas, is Hannah's granddaughter, and we grew up playing in the bush along the creek. We had a lot of bush foods from my grandmother. They always ate the native spinach because it was just growing everywhere, and we always had the bush carrots. We were taught to dig that up, and they are like a yam, and they taste like a parsnip, but I think they taste kind of almondy, and they're a bit peppery. Very abundant food source. My dad was always talking to us about country, like he made us very aware from when we were really little that this place was really important, and we'd do a lot of bushwalking and teaching us in that really Aboriginal way to have a conversation with country. And my grandmother and my uncles, they zealously cleared country all the time with fire. It was really important to them.
This floodplain was once covered by Dugga river flat forest. Early explorers recorded evidence of the cultivation of yams along the low-lying riverbanks in this area, through Wongi, Wilberforce, to Pitt Town and Cat-Eye, and up the river towards Marangara, Richmond and Yarramundi. Let's continue on the riverside path, stopping on this side at the 2-storey building, the Water Ski Clubhouse.
There's a story that Dharamulan, he only has 1 foot. The places where he steps is where the seed of the yam is put along the rivers. So the floodplains of the Dyarubbin. So all along out near Wilberforce, the low-level floodplains, all the prime farming country is where you'll find the yams. Dharamulan, he's Baime's son, and he is the most revered ancestral being. He's the enforcer, he's the one who takes boys through initiation, and he's also associated with the rainbow and rainbow serpents and the emus as well. That is also a shape that he transforms into. Baime is our creator. He created everything on the east coast of New South Wales, and that story, that songline, is the length of Australia. So from Mount Yengo is 1 step, and then he's got another step somewhere in Queensland, because these creatures are enormous, like the eel. You know, they're giant beings. At Palm Beach, you can see him laying down on country there. Brewarrina fish traps out there. So this is the scope of his story. Massive, absolutely massive. And fascinating. Aboriginal people do share stories. That is what a songline is. So you each have a little bit of that knowledge. And as you travel down it, you're given a little bit more, or you know it because you know the song, which is the map of country, what you're looking for, the sights and the food.
Gurangady, the great shape-shifting eel, is another of our creator beings. In a shared story along the length of the river, he tears through Nora country, shaping the landscape with the force of his flood plough. Dyarubbin, Dyarubbin, our name for the river, may mean waterway or yam. Large pockets of this park, as well as stretches of riverbank up and downstream of here, slumped and fell away in the major flooding in 2021 and 2022. Clearing of the banks along the river makes it more vulnerable to erosion and collapse.
Depending on where the water comes and how quickly it comes down, we get these really fast, energetic flows from draining the Warragamba and the up in the Nepean catchment, and we get massive floods through here. And because of the speed of the water and the depth of the flow, that has extraordinary erosive power. And because we had removed a lot of the bank vegetation and cleared the floodplains, we've actually looked at this little stretch where the vegetation had been left intact. The banks were much more resistant to the erosive power and the large floods that came through in the 50s and the 60s. It's not a perfect relationship. You do get circumstances where a vegetated bank with large trees will just slide down in to the river after a flood. But in general, the tree roots actually reinforce the bank soils in much the same way that reinforcing steel is used to strengthen concrete.
In 1794, colonists moved onto the fertile river flats without any negotiation with our people, clearing the Dogga forest and our yam beds to start their farms. Within 5 years, around 68 kilometres of river and creek frontage had been settled. Trees were felled into the river and used for local boat building, with much of the best timber sold and shipped overseas. In 1803, in an attempt to slow riverbank erosion, Governor King issued an order not to clear vegetation within 10 metres of the river's banks.
From the improvident method taken by the first settlers on the sides of the Hawkesbury in cutting down timber and cultivating the banks, many acres of grounds have been removed, lands inundated, houses, stacks of wheat and stock washed away by former floods, which might have been prevented in some measure if the trees and other native plants had been suffered to remain. It is hereby directed that no settler on the sides of any river or creek where timber is now growing do on any account cut down or destroy any tree or shrub growing within 2 rods of the edge of the bank. It is earnestly recommended to those who hold farms on the side of any river or creek liable to floods and which have been cleared of timber to replant the banks with such binding plants and trees as they can procure. Governor King, General Orders, October 4, 1803.
Michael Patterson is Land Management Officer with Hawkesbury City Council and travels the river monitoring water quality and riparian or riverbank vegetation. Current legislation protects vegetation within 40 metres of the riverbank, but the capacity and the will of government agencies to enforce this legislation is missing.
Overall, the river's not too bad in its riparian vegetation. Could be a lot better, could be a lot bigger areas of healthy native riparian vegetation. There's still a lot of development along the river and people enjoy river views, so that puts pressure on riparian vegetation. The areas that are densely vegetated, and that's all layers of vegetation from ground covers through to shrubs and trees, from what we've seen travelling down the river, they held up a lot better through the flooding than obviously areas that are bare of vegetation. But even sites that are just treed but with no other vegetation structure also suffered a lot because the water's got the opportunity to run around the trees and undermines them, which is why we see so many casuarinas down along the river at the moment where they're either mown around or there's just not that full vegetative structure of the riparian zone, so the water's managed to dig them out. It's the main legislation we work with for foreshore development is the Water Management Act of New South Wales. So if anybody wants to develop within 40 metres of the river, it has to be approved by council, but we refer a lot of those sorts of development applications to Water New South Wales for their approval. The main impact, other than the devastation that the flooding causes both to the environment and to people, is just the sediment that ends up coming down the river. From what we've seen from the last flood, there's been a lot of rubbish floating along the river, which, especially in a big flood, you can expect that. It's difficult to batten everything down. We don't monitor for heavy metals or anything like that, but you would expect the concentrations of toxic pollutants would rise significantly with floodwaters, because you're getting everything coming in rather than what generally flows in. So if there's farm chemicals or any chemicals from any other factory or organisations that are holding something, that sort of stuff can end up in the river after a flood. So the toxic chemicals that nobody sees are probably a big issue with flooding, that's for sure.
By now, you've probably arrived at the Upper Hawkesbury Powerboat Clubhouse. The riverbank in front of the clubhouse slumped significantly during major flooding in 2022. Governor Phillip Park is often the gathering ground for community and water skiing events. Water skiing has been a much-loved sport on the river since the 1950s. The boat ramp on Wianamatta at the end of this park is the launching place for many skiers and the finishing point for Australia's internationally renowned water ski race, the annual Bridge to Bridge Water Ski Classic, from Danga Island near Brooklyn in the river's mouth to Windsor. Usually held in November each year, the race was cancelled in 2021 and 2022 due to floods.
Hi, it's Steve Austin from Sackville. I'm only new to the area, but I've been water skiing here for probably 35 years. I've done about 35 bridge to bridges. I love the river. It's the best place to be water skiing in Australia, really. It's just beautiful. It's very rural. Everyone that comes up here has just got one thing in mind, is water skiing. It's just a big, big deal. The bridge to bridge, that's 112 kilometres, but that's just skiing straight. There's no zigzagging, it's just straight down the line.
You get tired?
You do. You don't show it, especially the guy you're skiing with, The bridge to bridge is a 2-up ski race, so you've got a ski partner. I'm still doing it. I'm nearly 57 and I'm still doing it.
How long does
Still
it
loving
take? The bridge to bridge?
Well, the record's about 38 minutes. I've skied under 50. It's the adrenaline. It's an adrenaline sport. It's great. I'm loving it. It's not a big a deal as it used to be. You used to get so many people down there at the aquatic stadium there to see the end of it. You'd probably get 3,000 or 4,000 people. I reckon now you'd be lucky to get 1,000. There used to be probably 450 boats in it. Now there's probably lucky to even get 100. You're not getting all those people that are supporting the cruise. Everything's down, so it's just getting expensive. Insurances are high. I'll keep doing it until I can't do it anymore, or the finances say I can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
But my kids love skiing. They're doing it. It's good for family.
Yeah.
It's a great family sport. So I've had some pretty horrible accidents. I've had a couple of really bad falls. I hit a bit of wood. There was a bit of wood in the river, and I didn't see it. My ski partner saw it, and he sort of skied around it, and I didn't see it and hit it. And it was only probably 6 inches by 6 inches. It was only a small bit. If you're doing sort of 95 miles an hour, you're going to slam it. The velocity is heaps. So it was bad. I didn't break anything, but I didn't walk hardly very well for a week. There's been a lot of people killed in ski racing. So I plan to swim the river every day. Well, I've been doing it for 35 years, and once I had a bit of a skin irritation from it. It was sort of a little thing that ate the pigment out of your skin. So I just had to cover myself in Selsun for a week, and that was it, and that was cleared it all up. That was from the doctor. Yeah, it was lice. It was a lice. It sort of got into your skin and ate all the colour out of your skin. That all looked like white dots over me, and that was from the river, yeah.
So you've had a caravan on the river all that time?
Yeah, Pacific Park, the pit town side of the river, up near the golf course, riverside. It was either 90 or 91. That was the big one I saw. Well, I used to live at Leppington, and we had to come all the way here to move the caravans 3 times in 1 year. A lot of people don't go down and get them, and if they don't get down and get them, they're going to end up floating down the river, and they have. We're just such mad skiers that the week after the flood we'd go out there and we'd be sort of skiing past dead cows and caravans and all sorts of things, Yeah, we saw some horrible things.
The impacts of repeated flooding and the destruction of riverbank crops downstream of here is what brought many riverside farmers in the 1960s to open up their lands to water skiers as caravan parks and picnic grounds and for river access. Sue Rosen, historian and author of Losing Ground, an environmental history of the Hawkesbury Nepean, interviewed several farmers along the river during the 1990s, including Frank Lawton, Harold Hall, Chester Smith and Athol Kemp.
Skiing really and truly didn't start anywhere on the river, not with any degree of numbers, until the late 50s. Those days I used to prawn up as far as Stackville. What the flood didn't do in damage, like washing eroded, when the flood had gone down, the effluent in the water caused the trees to rot around the ground level. I had to pull all the orchard out, level it all off and go in and see if I could make something out of a picnic ground. So it was successful, but a lot of people have got the idea that the ski boats contributed to the erosion of the bank. They didn't in any way. You get these boats now on the river and they're riding on top of the water. They don't even make a ripple when the boat goes past and it hits the shore. There was Caddy Park up the river. There was mine, Port Eringuy, Pacific Park, Sackville Ski Garden.
So they would have been made out of what would have been used as farmland before?
Well, they had no alternative, see, they had to do something to make a living.
Right.
In 1961, we were getting so bashed with floods and farming, finances in general, and we said, well, looks like we better go with it and start skiing. We got in contact with the ski association and they used Dharug for quite a few years as their main source of water skiing. That sort of started us off and we more or less turned into a caravan from that day, from 61 on. Well, actually, I'd say about the first caravan park in the river. And we used to have people ringing us up from all over the area, local people. Don't let that crowd in. They really were upset because we were letting the public into the beautiful Hawkesbury River at Lower Portsmouth. Actually, there's not as much produce grown in the river as there used to be, ever since we opened the ski ground.
So I fished the river, I've water skied on, I've watched the changes take place. I'm a descendant of the original Peter Kemp, came out as a convict. I fought this one for a long time, it didn't get very far. The influence of boating on the river, water skiing, man introduced recreation, which is a lovely recreation certainly, but the upper reach of the river is not suitable for it. It's actually predisposing the banks to the ravage of a flood, in other words making flood damage worse, and it doesn't allow natural restoration to take place. In the past, before water skiing reached saturation, a major flood would certainly do some damage. You get subsidence, and smaller floods, minor floods, would build up the toe of the bank. Vegetation would come through and it would restore itself, you know. That doesn't happen anymore. Now, in the past, one flood might take it away, but the next flood would build it up again, you know. And this is not happening. It's not allowed to happen because of the wave action of power boats every weekend.
Yeah.
Man's upset the nature's balance on the river with all these boats rearing up and down.
For the same reason, many floodplain farmers in this area turned from fruit, vegetables and dairy to turf, as it had the best chance of withstanding flooding. Turf farming began in the area in the 1930s and expanded greatly in the 1980s. On both sides of the river here, we are surrounded by turf farms. Turf production today is one of the Hawkesbury's largest industries. Let's start heading now to the other side of the clubhouse. Look out for the large rock boulder with the brass monument at the top of the riverbank. We'll head there now.
My name's Richie Benson. I work for the National Parks and Wildlife Service as a Senior Field Officer for Bush Regeneration. I've grown up here on the river and have a strong connection to it. I do lots of environmental activities, including land care, looking after riverbanks, doing lots of planting. The riverbank erosion, I've seen metres disappear just in probably the past 10 years that I've actually really watched and understood what might be happening around me, so I keep an eye out for it a lot more. From both farming and boats on the river. Wakeboard boats seem to be the worst because the waves are so huge and they seem to be getting bigger and bigger with ballast in them as well. So that causes a lot of damage. And when we get king tides, we get those around Christmas, and Christmas is when everyone wants to be on the river. Yeah. So you get erosion a lot higher up and you get massive damage. 40% of river water up around the Windsor area is actually treated effluent. So I definitely wouldn't swim there. I think it's really good in the way that it promotes growth of reed bed and ribbonweed and other weed patches on the bottom of the river, the high nutrients, because it helps that stuff to grow, which is a problem. But for fish and fish breeding, it's really good because there's so much habitat now for fish to breed and then to live in, basically. When you get aquatic weeds in the river, they take off like the salvinia did back in 2004 because of the high nutrients and the lack of control of it in the river. Okay. Windsor to North Richmond's probably the worst because it is very shallow there as well.
This park is named after Governor Phillip, the first governor of the colony, who came out with the first fleet in 1788, establishing a penal settlement of around 1,000 people at Warrum, Sydney Cove. Little over a month after he had arrived, Governor Phillip sailed into Broken Bay, the mouth of the Hawkesbury River, coming as far as Dangar Island near the present-day township of Brooklyn. In June 1789, his second expedition, Phillip identified the river and named it after Lord Hawkesbury, the president of the Board of Trade in Britain. Jan Barclay Jack, local historian and author of Hawkesbury Settlement Revealed.
Phillip and Hunter and other gentlemen and a couple of convicts came up the river in 1789. Now, the Europeans could see as they rode up the river that there were fires, there were encampments, but the Aboriginal people didn't come down to meet them. And it wasn't till Little Cat-Eye Creek, quite a way up the river, that the first two confident Aboriginal people came down to meet them in the boats. There was patience and courtesy in trying to understand each other, and they did that through gifts. There was real keenness in that first meeting, but that was all there was. Then they just rode on, and they didn't meet any other Aboriginal people, even though they knew they were there. On that trip, they studied the landscape pretty closely as they went along, and they did see round about Windsor, where the banks are much lower and the land was lightly wooded. They could see evidence that there had been digging on the banks for something that they identified as being a small yam. Up in the trees, very high above the river, there were huge pieces of grass strung up as if they'd been on the top of the water that had risen, and they recognised this as flooding and that it was an extremely high flood. This was a dangerous river, and Phillip determined right then and there that with the limited amount of support from the military that he had, there was no way he was going to settle this area.
In 1791, Phillip, Hunter and Watkin Tench came overland to Dyarubbin from Parramatta. This time, Phillip meets the Aboriginal leaders Gomberee and his son Yarramundi, or Yarramundi as he's also known. They met just down the river from here at Balga Ngurrang Creek near Pitttown. Balga Ngurrang means little water. It's one of the few places along the river which retains its original name. Emeritus Professor of History at the University of New South Wales and author of People of the River, Grace Karskens.
Gomberee and Yarramundi are paddling along the river, somewhere around Balga Ngurrang Creek, and that's where they meet. There's a really important exchange, and Gomberee welcomes them to country, and this is where you get such a vivid glimpse of the importance of protocols in Aboriginal society. You have to be polite. You can't just barge in on people's country and not make yourself known. And by the end of the night, everybody sleeps around a fire together, and Yarramundi has his little boy with him, Jimba. Tench is watching them sleeping, and then Yarramundi carefully turns over and carefully puts the child next to him again and cuddles him around the fire. It's very rare that you get a little glimpse of the past like that that's very intimate. It was a very positive meeting. It's just so tragic that it's also a turning point which led to such a disaster for the Dharug and Dharug people on the river. But it started out well. There was friendship and trust, and stories were exchanged, and people slept in peace. I just imagine this as a fire-lit globe in the darkness alongside that river, that long ago night.
Governor Arthur Phillip is often remembered as an enlightened leader who was kind to our people, upholding his official orders. But Phillip knew early on how Aboriginal people felt about the establishment of the colony. In September 1788, in a letter to Lord Sydney, Phillip wrote, "They are certainly not pleased with us remaining amongst them. Despite his early good intentions and attempts at friendship, Governor Arthur Phillip imposed British law on our people, and we had our own laws. He ordered his soldiers to harm and kill Aboriginal people and instigated the destruction of our country and resources, ultimately displacing our people.
So after that expedition, I think news about this river and the Aboriginal people there being friendly would have travelled like wildfire through the whole of the colony on the coast, and especially stories about rich soil and lagoons full of waterfowl, of birds, because a lot of the people who have been sent out from England, most of them convicts, and some of the soldiers, they come from a place where their commons have been destroyed. They were hunters themselves. They were just people who lived off the land of their commons. But of course that's been taken away from them in England, and that's why a lot of them ended up in New South Wales, because they've been dispossessed themselves. You can see the irony of this, right? Everybody talks to everybody about what they've seen, and when people like James Ruse, who's slaving away on his farm near Parramatta, which is shale soil, not so rich, he hears about this and he thinks, I could make a break for this. I could go out there.
You've probably now reached the Rock and Brass Monument. It is dedicated to the first 22 Hawkesbury pioneer settlers Lieutenant Governor Gross placed on the banks of the Hawkesbury in 1794. For Aboriginal people, the ever-increasing numbers of ex-convict colonists moving in along the river brought sickness and death, starvation and war, racism and trauma, forcing our culture, language and people underground. Our people survived, but not without great loss, which began with the arrival of these 22 settlers here in 1794 and continues to affect our people to this day. Today, there is still no monument here that recognises our people, our loss, our dispossession of country, and the silencing of our cultures. Governor Phillip sailed back to England in 1792 with health issues, and acting Governor Gross ignored Phillip's decision not to settle the Hawkesbury. Historians now believe that colonisation here along the river was likely led by the ex-convicts themselves. Let's start heading towards Wianamatta, the South Creek confluence. Stay close to the river if you can, and we'll walk down in front of the trees to Wianamatta's mouth, where we can see the place James Ruse chose for his farm.
It's quite clear that Ruse and Williams requested to be allowed to settle on the banks of the Hawkesbury. I take that proof from Colin's diary. Colin says that the two farmers were permitted to settle, and that implies strongly that they had requested it, because every other time Collins, who's quite precise with his language, talks about settlers beginning on farms like at Parramatta, he says that the governor settled them there. Francis Gross, who'd been the head of the military, was left in charge of the colony, and he certainly didn't like writing down his thoughts. Gross made no recordings of it. He set up absolutely no infrastructure. It's hard not to see that Gross saw the Hawkesbury settlement as just a convenient way of getting rid of a lot of ex-convicts who were starting to finish their terms of transportation, and this was a way that he could fulfil what he was supposed to be doing as acting governor, but at the same time, by having them settle so far away, about 50 k's away from Parramatta, then he had effectively got rid of a problem, because he didn't believe that they should be getting land at all. It's long been known that a lot of those first 22 settlers all came out on the Scarborough on the first fleet together. They didn't stop coming in April of 1794. They continuously came to the river, and at least in the first 6 months, what I found was that a very, very large percentage of them had all been with Ruse on the same hulk on the Thames before they even came on the transport ship. Some of them had known each other a decade.
We'll stop for a while when we reach the mouth of Wianamatta.
The other thing they noticed, even on that first trip, that would have made it very mysterious, are these amazing tall river flat forests. They have very tall trees, cabbage gums and red gums, and they are very dense and viney. So this is a sort of river flat forest that grows on most of the margins of rivers on the east coast of Australia because the soil is very rich. But when they come past creek junctions, they see places that are open. There's grass and the trees are large, but they're spaced wide apart. We now know why they were kept like that by Aboriginal people, but they didn't realise that at the time. And those are the places which I think the convicts and ex-convicts that were in the exploration party would have eyed off, because, you know, clearing that dense forest by yourself with an axe is a very, very slow and laborious process.
For our people, the creek and river junctions were our meeting places. We would have kept them clear with fire. They would have been good places to camp, to launch ngawi, canoes, and for our women to harvest yams. On the other side of Wianamatta, in an almost circular bend of the creek, is Dyarubbin. Dyarubbin was most likely a corroboree ground, a meeting and gathering place. It is one of 178 places along the river whose names have recently been returned to us. In 1829, the Presbyterian minister of the church just downriver at Pitttown, Reverend John McGarvey, made around 8 walking trips along the river, recording Aboriginal place names. It was this prime, cleared site which James Ruse chose to start his farm. Those who came with him spread themselves downriver from Ruse, along what we now call Pitttown Bottoms, and upstream from Ruse, along the opposite bank of Wianamatta South Creek, which they initially called Ruse's Creek.
It soon became pretty obvious that you didn't have to work as hard on a farm on the river as you did in some of the other areas. Food grew quite easily. I mean, you still had to work hard to sow it and harvest it, and it's all done by hand. There's no horses and no bullocks, but they still had time to enjoy themselves. They gambled. They got alcohol somehow and had big parties. This is not what's supposed to happen in a convict colony. So, of course, the authorities are outraged by this, but they really needed that grain, and so that's how it kept growing. And word got out in the community, and more people. It was the first land rush, 400 within a few months. Can you imagine the impact on the local landscapes, the paths that you're using, your ceremonial sites? Everything would have been more and more disrupted. It's actually only a few months later that a settler gets killed. We don't know how many Aboriginal people got killed in the process. They don't all have guns. Some have guns, and Aboriginal people are pretty scared of guns because they know what they can do. But settlers are also sitting ducks because the spears are deadly too. If you want to kill someone with a death spear, you do it. Settlers knew that it was dangerous.
In each of the killings of Aboriginal people in those first years and their retaliation, there's evidence that the conflict over food sources was really basic to it. The first one is a reported shooting of somebody on what was called the race ground, which was a kangaroo hunting site. So again, it was the Europeans taking the Aboriginal food.
The race ground was a basin of flat low ground just southeast of the early farms on opposite bank of Wianamatta South Creek. Later known as Killarney Chain of Ponds, part of the Mackenzie's Creek, which flows into Wianamatta just upstream. This was a rich hunting and gathering ground and a camping place for our people. Around 1798, another Aboriginal man was killed there after challenging a European who had shot a kangaroo.
It's not only the taking of land, it's also because they broke all kinds of moral laws. They stole women and raped them. They stole Aboriginal children, mostly babies and toddlers. And that's the worst grief ever. And I think it's been underestimated in historical accounts. This constant law breaking is causing them to be punished under Aboriginal law, and that's why some people are targeted for doing what they do. Some settlers share their corn with Aboriginal people. They don't want to get speared. They don't want their house to get burnt down. Other people shoot at them. But then slowly there's this realisation that these people are here to stay and they're not shifting, and that would have been a horrifying realisation, and that's when you get acts of war as well as law. So what the warriors would do would be to attack the people furthest away on the outer reaches and also up South Creek.
In 1799, the farm of Wianamatta and Gurangady of South Creek was raided by a group of about 17 Aboriginal people, though no one was harmed. In evidence he later gave to the court, Gurangady described conversations with Aboriginal men, Major White and Morgan, who told him that they were angry with the white men and particularly the soldiers, but they were not angry with him because he was a good fellow.
But it gets worse and worse as the British authorities send in their soldiers. Local settlers form posses and they march out into the mountains. The settlers can't catch warriors after they attack farms. There's no way they can even keep up with them. But what they learn is where the camps are, and they sneak up on them in the early morning as a surprise attack. And settlers learn how to do this on Dyarubbin, and that's a tactic that goes right across Australia for the rest of the 19th century.
On Dyarubbin's floodplains, on Burra country in the Windsor and Richmond areas, are sites of the first recorded massacres perpetrated on Aboriginal people by settlers and by the military in modern Australian history. Our places are still here in the landscape. Just downstream from here, where the river turns at the end of this reach, is Nurragingy by grandmother's place. Our senior women are held in high respect as knowledge holders and play an important role in ceremonies. Just beyond Nurragingy is Gulai Bara, place of eel nets. This part of Dyarubbin was most likely a women's area. Making of nets for string, for catching butter or eels, Mogra fish, Yarramundi ducks was women's work. Let's head along Wianamatta now to the wharf. Depending on the vegetation here, you might have to walk back a little way along Dyarubbin, then head down across the boat ramp to the wharf. Colonists kept arriving and being granted farms along the river and creeks, their produce becoming essential to the colony's food supply. In 1795, this park where we are standing now, a 1794 grant to William Bond, was purchased by ex-convict John Stogdill for £30. One of only 2 ex-convicts who were able to buy land at this time. Stogdill was a highly literate ex-convict who managed all the business and personal affairs of Commissary John Palmer. In 1798, Stogdill bought James Ruse's grant, opposite us here, for £300. By 1801, Stogdill and Palmer had acquired all the land around the mouth of South Creek and the entire area on this side of the creek we know today as the Peninsula. They ran a huge enterprise which shipped produce down the river from here to Palmer's estate at Woolloomooloo, Sydney. Stogdill also ran a pub on South Creek called the Bush Inn. He had 50 men working for him. He drowned in 1801, attempting to swim his horse through the floodwaters.
This river, whether we call it Hawkesbury or Nepean, is the Nile of Botany Bay. For the land on the banks owes its fertility to the floods which come down from the Blue Mountains, and which have been known to swell the waters nearly 100 feet above their usual level. After the flood of 1817, the colony is now almost independent of these flood farmers. The extraordinary fertility of these flooded lands, which have borne a crop of wheat and a crop of maize in each year for the last 25 years, has naturally induced their tenants to see nothing in present ruin, but the prospect of future riches. Barren Field, Geographical Memoirs on New South Wales, 1817.
Wianamatta, which the settlers called South Creek, flows around 70 kilometres from southwestern Sydney to Windsor. Wianamatta means mother's place in Dharug, the Dharug language, and the creek has been dual named since 2003. For our people, creeks were important living spaces and connection pathways. Freshwater mussels, mullet and perch, eels, crayfish, yams and turtles would have been food for our people, sourced from both creeks and the river.
Nurragingy is a Dharug man who was the leader of the group the settlers called the South Creek tribe. Very well known as one of these extraordinary cross-cultural envoys. The Aboriginal men who did step forward and tried to negotiate, to work with the settlers, and sometimes to fight against them. As he grew up, he would have seen the impact and the horrors of the invasion and the frontier wars. Nurragingy was one of the leaders approached to put one of his sons into Macquarie's native institution. This is another way that governors and the white elite tried to, in inverted commas, civilise Aboriginal people by taking their children and putting them in this school. They couldn't get anyone to agree to do that. So one way they tried to get some children for the school was to, I would say, lean on these leaders, and it was quite successful. Nurragingy gave up one of his sons. Ironically, Nurragingy and a number of other Aboriginal men who had become guides for white people was persuaded to join Macquarie's military attacks on other Aboriginal people. They were supposed to guide the military parties in searching for and killing Aboriginal people. It appears that the group that Nurragingy was with didn't see any Aboriginal people, so that tells you how hard he was guiding. They certainly did not lead them straight to their kinsmen. For that, Nurragingy and Colby, the other well-known Aboriginal cross-cultural envoy in the Hawkesbury, were jointly granted a farm at what is now known as Plumpton. Nurragingy and his family lived there for quite some years. They didn't live there permanently, but they ran cattle there. After Colby died, Maria Locke, the famous Dharug matriarch, who was just an extraordinary woman herself, applied for that country and struggled and finally acquired it and moved her family there from, I think, the 1840s.
Nurragingy Reserve in Doonside on Wianamatta tributary, Eastern Creek, commemorates Nurragingy and Colby, but the land which was granted to them, which Maria Locke fought to retain, was taken from her descendants in 1900. The oral community has tried several times unsuccessfully to reclaim this site. Amongst the engravings are people etched to the rock along Dyarubbin's banks are engravings of Gurangady, the great eel, Mulgura, fish, Marion, emus, Borogan, echidna, burrel, kangaroo, and more recently engravings of European sailing boats. Dharug artist, writer and educator Jasmine Seymour.
Aboriginal people started to work on boats because, not all settlers were bad, and some of them would have had very strong relationships. Many of the settlers married Aboriginal people. They were their wives. They would have been their families. And many Aboriginal people went out to sea with those boats. You can see how very quickly they would have become very important to Aboriginal people. These great big vessels that move up and down the Dyarubbin, and how adaptable Aboriginal people were. They're everywhere, the boats. And so that's a very recent addition to the art of the area, and you can see continuing culture through that because they need to represent what is happening to them.
We're listening to the underwater sound of Wianamatta. Water scientist Dr. Ian Wright brings his students from Western Sydney University here regularly to conduct water testing.
If something's important to society, we measure it. So Sydney Water test because they discharge a lot of sewage wastes into the river, so they're required to. And also Water New South Wales test. So both those authorities test. Sometimes we can get their data, but it's not generally publicly available. I just believe in the community right to know. And for example, this, South Creek, it's got a reputation of being something in the order of 90% sewage effluent. And in summer last year, the Hawkesbury was about 30% effluent, the flow in the river. It's treated, generally a bit more than primary, secondary and tertiary. Their level of treatment is getting higher.
I didn't realise South Creek was so polluted, and that affects Hawkesbury River. That's what we're obviously going to try and find overall.
And then we also test turbidity. Turbidity is just how clear the water is.
Yeah. What was the turbidity?
68.5 for D2D.
D2D.
Some of the samples we were getting last week from the creek were like 100 and something. Most like clean drinking water would be like a 7.
Yeah, and this is a super popular area for canoeing, for fishing, for water skiing. And whether you want to or not, as water sports, you will come in contact with water. So there are so many health risks, and that's what concerns me, that isn't shared. And in fact, when we're sitting here doing this testing, a number of people come up and ask us, what's the water like? But at the moment, it's very poor because of the rain. I mean, look at the colour of that. I'd call it a milk chocolate. A fair chunk of land is in the water there today. With all the urban development we're having in Western Sydney, all the building sites in heavy, heavy rain, they can't contain the sediment, and particularly the clay faction, that can stay suspended for days and even weeks, those fine particles, and a whole myriad of issues associated with that.
I guess the more nitrates and phosphates, the more likely you kind of are to get algal blooms and things like that.
We just went up about, 800 metres, and I just said to the class, everywhere I look there's weeds. Weeds. And you get the odd native, but again you see the climbers sending their tentacles up there. And you can see we're in this beautiful stand of she-oaks here, and the only reason they're here, you can see climbing vines coming off from the bank, going up. And if they don't remove that, that will strangle them. But it's a battle. It's an absolute battle. And looking in there, the weeds are winning that battle. Yeah. Their data shows that the river's full of sediment, nitrate, phosphate, and very low oxygen. So the oxygen in the river last week and this week would be quite stressful for a lot of fish as well. But those high nutrients are actually really good for the farmers. We have heaps of irrigation here. This is part of the food bowl of Sydney. Probably more turf than food.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. But even if you think of it, like at the end of the Hawkesbury, they've got all like oyster farms, and all of the junk from here is going out. Yeah. It's like all of the metals, the sediment.
This is the Hawkesbury River. All the tributaries of this provide Sydney with about 98% of our drinking water. Warragamba's one, Avon, Cataract, Cordo, Winchicaraby, goes on and on and on. This river gives so much to us, most people don't even realise. And in return, we give it effluent and runoff. What is ironic for me is they actually make a fortune out of the river. It makes, I think it's 2.8 billion in revenue, and part of that is the cost of sewage. They bill people for sewage, but it's also the water that we consume, and that makes a profit for the government. And the last year that I saw the financial records, the annual report, the government got a bounty of something in the order of 600 million, which is basically from the river, because that's where our water supply comes from. This is like a scale model of the Murray-Darling. We're here at Windsor. We're like Renmark, we're well down the system, and what we're getting here depends on the land use practices upstream of here. But I think we've crossed the line where Commonwealth legislation should cut in if the state isn't looking after resources, much as what happens under the Murray-Darling Basin. I think Hawkesbury is now of a condition that it shows me that the state government can't look after this. Can't or won't, I don't know.
Let's head up the bank now behind the wharf and up the grass till we reach the fence line that divides the park from the turf farms. There is no path here, so you might prefer to walk up the road a little till you can cross over onto the grass, but please take care. Being in the heart of the area where colonists first established farms, and right beside what became the township of Windsor, Wianamatta South Creek became a hub of industry. It was navigable to the largest of ships. It's hard to fathom, but in 1885, the 52-tonne steamboat St Albans was built and launched on the banks of South Creek. She was 23 metres long and carried cargo and passengers between Windsor and St Albans for many years. Several tanneries operated on South Creek through the 1800s, including one at Andrew Thompson's Red House Farm on the McGrath's hillside of South Creek, and the Peninsula Tannery on this side, which ran successfully until 1957. Tanning used a huge amount of water which came from South Creek. The local wattle bark was used to cure the hides. Scott Will is the current owner of the Peninsula Tannery site. which is a little further along South Creek after it winds around the turf farms beside us.
You'll see the timber sticking out on the embankment and the pipework that used to just flush out into the creek. That's as far as the tannery buildings used to come. This is one of the tannery sheds. They were up to 4 stories high. It was the biggest tannery in New South Wales at the time, because they used to walk around on the walls of the pits, pulling out the leather and changing it. The pits are all on the bottom, and then you just got massive timber buildings on top of them, and with mezzanine floors, and that one was for drying the leather. This one was for skinning and removing the hair, and so they used to send the leather from here to the shoe factory where the School of Arts was. When they were running the largest tannery in the state, it was harness leather. Some of the pits I've dug out, or the water bucket, you can still find it. Said I've disturbed a couple, but I think we worked out there's over 200 pits here. So what relied on the water was there used to be a brewery. It used to actually sit on the next property that is now Crown land, and it was Andrew Thompson's brewery. But before that was a brewery, it was the first church, school. If you look on the old maps of 1827, it's the biggest building in Windsor. Where our property is now, that's the only place you can actually get to the water. And there was a staircase that went up to the street. One of the stories I got told is that they used to actually bring the convicts down South Creek, which makes sense because you had the courthouse, the jail. They didn't take them through Thompson Square, which was more your trading part. You would have had the respectable people up that end. They brought them in like the back door. And there used to be a wharf, and there was a wharf down there, I know, in the 40s.
Windsor Jail was beside the tannery on the banks of the South Creek, and in the 1864 floods, which reached 14.6 metres, it was inundated. The jailer broke a hole in the jail wall to liberate the prisoners who were taken into the nearby granary. In the same flood, the toll house beside the creek collapsed. Let's start heading along the fence line now, back towards where we started. If you look over the fence and across the paddocks, in the distance you'll see the distinctive buildings of Tebbett's Observatory, with its red brick, domed roofs and white columns. Wianamatta is just behind it. John Tebbett was an enthusiastic amateur astronomer who built several observatories on the property known as the Peninsula Farm. Born in Windsor in 1834, he was featured on Australia's first $100 note. Tebbett achieved international recognition for his discovery of the 1861 comet Tebbett. Tebbett was also renowned for his accurate measurements of weather and flood levels from 1855 to 1897. During the 1867 flood, the highest on record, at 19.3 metres, water rose more than 10 feet through the house his father had built in the 1840s, which had never flooded before. This area was, and still is, known as the Peninsula, as it is almost encircled by the creek. Just up in amongst the houses beyond the turf farms is a place our people knew as Wallaroobury, referring to the Wallaroos and the black kangaroos. Perhaps the Wallaroos also favoured this fertile stretch on the Balga, the hill between Wianamatta and Dyarubbin, before the colonists came.
Hannah Locke was very dark-skinned, and she's living with a white man, George Morley, behind the McGrath Hill pub on South Creek. I just think that must have been an extraordinary situation to have this family of Aboriginal kids who very much look Aboriginal. And then for their children who are lighter skinned, they've been taught not to say anything about it ever, because to blend in is the way of survival. My family, while we always knew we were Aboriginal, took great pains to be as white as possible. When you know what happened with the stolen generation and the government coming in and deciding if you weren't clean enough or whether the yard didn't look good enough, if you weren't white enough, then they just take your kids for no reason at all. My uncle, he's still, even though he's 90 years old, has a terror of being found out that he's an Aboriginal person, because when he was growing up it was not a desirable thing to be. And they were as poor could be. He was using the boats. They spent a lot of time on the river. They grew up fishing for perch and mullet, and it was just living by and off the river. Because of course they didn't have the abundance of stuff that we have now. They really did use the land. A lot of the Morley family were put in the Sackville Reserve. There's this tiny little sliver of a dog leg, and one side is just cliff and the other side is river. There are no resources there. It's not a place where anyone could possibly thrive. All the last Aboriginal people in the Hawkesbury, that's where most of them ended up, around the late 1800s, early 1900s. Because by that time, of course, lots of those people married out into the settler families. People are very proud of their colonial history, and they've never been allowed to be proud of being Aboriginal. But I think that is changing now, and we need to be extremely proud of that. I'm a primary school teacher, and all the time I have kids say to me, I think I'm a Dharug person. And I go, well, you probably are, because I know that in families they talk about this Aboriginal person in their history. And if it's from this place, then it would have been a Borongal person. I think that is really fascinating, that underneath it all is still this huge Aboriginal presence who has never gone away.
Dyarubbin, the Hawkesbury Nepean, has the longest recorded flood history in modern Australia. In the 1970s, Sydney University's Robin Warner proposed a theory about the river's flood cycles, periods of major flooding followed by periods of drought and minor flooding, lasting between 30 and 50 years. This matches periods of major flooding in the 1900s, the 1930s, the 1960s, the 1990s, and most recently in the early 2020s. We went for a walk around the turf farms a few months after the March 2022 flood with Lisa Sullivan, who lives nearby in an 1846 heritage cottage impacted by the flooding.
As soon as Warragamba Dam spills, we've got about 8 hours until that reaches Windsor. For this one for us, we knew it was up high. We were watching the river heights. The tractors started to move up towards Tebbets to get to high ground. All of those turf farms that we were just walking on were covered by probably 3 to 6 metres of water deep. Huge amounts of water. Until you see it and you're paddling around in the canoe in it, it's pretty mind-blowing actually. In 2020, the water came really close to coming in the back of the house. We all breathed a sigh of relief. We did a bit of a practice run, and then a year later, the March 2021 floods came and we got hit pretty hard. We had nearly 3 metres of water through the house, and the basement rooms were inundated, and it went another metre or so above that. We physically were exhausted after last year and this year as well, but what we implemented this time round was getting a shipping container delivered that we filled with all of our furniture. We then got trades in. We got out as much as we could with as many trades as we could, because we knew that it meant less cost, I suppose, on the other side, but also if we didn't have to clean something, we didn't want to. It's a really hideous job, but then it still did need quite a number of hands on deck. Everything just needs to be moved. And so that was a full 24 hours. We were literally going hard. It was exhausting, and you think you'd hit a wall and you just look at it around and realise the water was still coming. I did also fail to mention that once the floodwater had receded here, we had 5 days of raw sewage flowing in our backyard in a fountain form. So that was not a pleasant thing. South Creek flows past the water treatment plant, and so that water that we're getting in our properties is contaminated water. So we need to do bacteria and mould cleanup. For us as a family, we've got through 2 of them. We've relaxed into this one a bit, not wanting to race into getting everything fixed up. Well, we can't, because we're in that insurance question of, are we actually even going to receive insurance coverage or not? We've got a roof over our heads, trying to work out whether having a safe environment to raise your family, I mean, that's obviously first and foremost what you want, but we are in this situation where we live in a flood affected home that once it's cleaned up, it's our beautiful home. You know, it's got that history, it's got that character. We love our community that we live in. If we moved, then we wouldn't have that. Those connections are significant in being able to live through a natural disaster.
Didgeridoo, thanks for your company. We hope you've enjoyed 11 stories from the River Dyarubbin's Governor Phillip Park audio walk in Balga Ngurrang, the hill camp of our people. For more information, please see Hawkesbury Regional Museum's website. There are 10 other audio walks along Dyarubbin that you can listen to. Naba Wunya, see you soon, and remember, Midiga, tread softly on this dreaming. This country is alive with the Gomberee and Yarramundi, the spirit of our ancestors. We were strong here, we remain strong here, and we will always be strong here.
We love Dyarubbin.